DND number 2, Suffer the Children in Jesus' Name, Chapter 11. Toby's mouth opened in astonishment. He stared at her, the blood draining from his face. Her mother was dying? And she wanted you to come see her before she died. Is that right, Caroline? Yes, sir, she whispered. Did you fly to Atlanta? She nodded, her eyes downcast. Caroline, did you even see George Mancini the night he died? She looked over at Toby. I'm sorry. I wanted to help you so much I thought I could do this. Lieutenant Verranza spoke softly now and kindly. Caroline, when was the last time you saw George alive? Back in May. That's what I thought. He was silent a moment while he waited for Caroline to collect herself. I know your mother died, Caroline, and that you just buried her a few days ago. I want you to know that I'm sorry for your loss. She sniffed again. He handed her a tissue. Caroline, why didn't you tell me? I was trying to help you, Toby. I couldn't stand the fact that you were charged with murder. You would never have any dealings with George Mancini if not for me. You would do that for me? I'd do anything for you. Lieutenant Verranza turned to Toby. She won't be in trouble now, so you can tell the truth. Toby looked into the detective's eyes. Stop wasting the taxpayers' money and tell me what really happened. And I'll tell you both right now that the time of death for Mancini was put at 1:30. At that time, Caroline was on a plane headed for Atlanta, and you were at the Nashville airport getting ready to board a plane to New York. Caroline gasped. You didn't kill George? He turned to look at her. I found him in your apartment when I came to pick you up. I thought you'd killed him accidentally and run away. And you told the police you killed him? Why? Why do you think? For me? You actually thought I killed George and you wanted to protect me? He smiled and shrugged. I'd do anything for you. But your career, you tossed away your career like it was nothing. Toby grimaced. Well, not like it was nothing. It was hard, but in exchange for your freedom, it was worth it. I can't believe it. It's like you really do love me. I really do. He looked up at the detective. Any more questions? The lieutenant frowned. I guess from what I'm hearing, neither of you knows a single thing about how George Mancini ended up dead in Caroline's apartment. They shook their heads in unison. He sighed. And I'm back to square one, and the two of you are not off the hook just yet. We're going to talk about the consequences of what you two pulled. I'll be right back. He left them alone. Toby stood and pulled Caroline into his arms. What you must be going through. I'm so sorry about your mom. It's okay. We talked, really talked, for the first time. It's a shame it had to be at the end. We wasted so much time when we could have been making memories. He smiled and changed the subject. You didn't kill George. She smiled. And neither did you. Lord, I've been so worried about you, and for nothing. She looked up into his face but didn't like what she saw. He was breathing heavy, his face pale, his brow covered with perspiration. Are you okay? Actually, I don't feel very well. Sit down. She didn't have to ask him twice. He was close to collapsing anyway. She went to the door. When it wouldn't open, she pounded on it. Lieutenant! The door opened almost immediately. There's something wrong with Toby. He's not well. Verranza knelt in front of him. You okay, son? I'm just a little dizzy. Tell you what, let's get you back to the hotel and we'll talk later. He took Toby by the arm and pulled him up, and Toby swayed heavily against him. I think I'm going to be sick. Okay, hold on. He grabbed a trash can, shoved it up toward Toby's face. Toby peered into the lieutenant's face, trying to focus. Going down, he mumbled as his body crumpled. Verranza dropped the trash can and grabbed Toby around the chest, easing him down. New scene. Caroline stood with Lieutenant Verranza outside an emergency room door, waiting to hear from a doctor. She'd called Toby's family, and they were on the way. Caroline peered nervously down the hall, then looked back at the lieutenant. He rubbed his hand over his hair, and Caroline smiled at him. Toby does that. He looked over at her. Toby runs his hands through his hair like that when he's worried or frustrated about something. The detective smiled. I'm both, and I think it's a universal man sort of thing. You think he's okay? Sure. The word sounded hollow. She never thought she would be the one trying to comfort the officer, but she smiled and patted his arm. I'm sure he'll be fine. He's very strong. Lieutenant Veranza looked the young woman over. Adorable. And strong as heck, considering what she'd been through over the past week. And now that the truth was out, he hoped she could shed some light on why Mancini had been in her apartment. Tell me about George Mancini, she sighed. He was a bad man. I hated him, but had no choice than to deal with him. It was the only place I could find to live. He was always making advances toward me, trying to force me to, well, you know. He touched her arm and nodded. Yes, unfortunately, I do know. And you know what? I'm glad Toby kicked his tail. She frowned. Well, it was pretty scary when it was happening. Toby's so large and so strong, I thought he was going to kill him right then. He smiled. You don't like confrontation very much, do you? Not at all. I guess I'm a wimp when it comes to that. You, sweetheart, are not a wimp in any way. So tell me, did Mancini have any friends that you know of? The only family we were able to find was an older sister who refused to talk to us through her drunken stupor, and no one in the building was willing to say very much. I saw him with women all the time. Don't ask me what they saw in him, especially Sherry. Every time I think about her, I just get so mad. Why? Who is Sherry? She's my downstairs neighbor. She's just a kid. 16 years old, I think. She doesn't say much. She lives there with her mother and her little brother. I walked in on her and George once. Actually, that's why he jumped on me. He remembered speaking to Sherry's mother. She'd had nothing to tell them. Tell me about Sherry. He was having his way with her. That's really all I know. I was on my way upstairs one day and Sherry's door was open and I looked in and George was with her, doing stuff, you know. Are you sure you didn't misread the situation? Oh, I'm sure. Sherry was all wrapped around him and begging him not to leave. It made me sick. She was willing then, not forced? She seemed to be willing enough, but she's a kid. He could have manipulated her somehow. Caroline suddenly looked down, ashamed. I should have done something. I should have gotten involved. He sighed. We don't always make the right decisions. She looked up with tears in her eyes. I know better, though. I should have done something. There were so many times in my life when I wished someone had stepped in. How so? She swallowed. My mother, she had problems, and she worked her way through those problems by hurting me. He patted her back. Okay, I understand. No wonder Toby was so protective of her, and no wonder she hated confrontation. Why didn't I do something to help her? Caroline vocally reprimanded herself. He touched her shoulder. Listen to me, young lady, because I've seen it all. First off, the girl wouldn't have listened to anything you had to say anyway. Secondly, Mancini threatened you, correct? How did you know that? You said he beat you up because you saw him and the girl together. It sounds pretty threatening to me. And I'm sure he made it clear that you weren't supposed to tell anyone. She nodded. You can't blame yourself for being afraid. From what you just told me, you've been pounded on most of your life, and that tends to make people a little shy. She smiled up at him. You're very kind. Oh, yeah, that's what my partner says, too. Lieutenant Veranza laughed. Well, you're also mean and scary when you want to be. Well, sorry about that. I was trying to get to the truth, and I was hoping you would know something more than you do. He sighed, looked at his watch. Lieutenant Veranza? Yes, he turned to see the doctor smiling. That was a good sign. Mr. Nash has a concussion. We've taken some scans, and there's no swelling to the brain. There is, however, a large lump on the back of his head. He says it was put there by one of your officers, and he'll be fine, though. He needs to be watched during the night. Wake him every 2 hours. Make sure he's responsive. 15 minutes later, Toby walked through the emergency room doors into the waiting area with a nurse at his side, chiding him for refusing a wheelchair. His family arrived at the same time, and Caroline found herself standing aside. She watched as Toby's family surrounded him with their love and warmth, and she secretly wished that she had experienced that sometime in her life. Lieutenant Veranza pulled Toby aside. I'm going to cut you two loose. Thank you, sir, Toby said. There's a public outcry about celeb Ellen and Joe's larger suite. They went over the events of the day. She was offered many condolences on the death of her mother before they turned their attention to Toby. It was amazing to Caroline to see how Toby's family all catered to each other. Everyone was talking and laughing and even joking about their most recent arrest. The television blared in the background, Jeff watching intently. A cell phone turned to a country station played softly. Glad the conversation had shifted away from her, Caroline curled up on the sofa and listened. The low conversation between Toby, his brother, sister, and his parents would be interrupted by bursts of laughter when someone made a snide remark. Toby glanced at her a few times, winked, making sure she didn't feel left out. No one could believe what Toby had been willing to throw away for Caroline's sake. She could hardly believe it herself. He was a good, strong man, and he was from a good, strong family. But she wasn't. She had no idea how a real family was supposed to interact with each other. Could she actually become a part of this family? She was sure he would ask her to marry him. There should be no question. She should jump at the opportunity. Yet as she sat there listening and watching, she was beginning to realize that she wasn't the best deal for Toby. She wasn't strong like his mother or sweet like his sister. She knew nothing about running a household. She'd never been taught to cook. She never even owned a washing machine, though it couldn't be much different from the laundromat she frequented. Toby wanted children and would be a wonderful father. But what kind of mother would she be? Lack of cooking and cleaning skills aside, would a spilled glass of milk or a failing grade push her over the edge? After all she'd been through, she thought she'd learned to waste no time and go for what she wanted, but what if the things she wanted weren't best for all those concerned? She had also just been given an education in self-sacrifice. Maybe there was a reason for that. Maybe she needed to sacrifice her own desires so that the person she loves most in the world can have a truly happy life, one she was unable to give. Additionally, Toby would want to live in Nashville, and she had a wonderful opportunity in New York with Madame Pierre. There was so much to think about. She promised herself she would think long and hard before she jumped into anything. And Toby moved to sit with her on the sofa, putting his arm around her and pulling her close, and she laid her on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" she whispered. "I'm tired and weak. You want to go to bed?" "Thought you'd never ask," she said. Hey, everyone, listen to this," Jeff called, turning up the volume on the TV as he spoke. New York, once again, is the background for a wonderful tale of love and sacrifice. They listened as the host of a popular news show told the tale of Toby Nash and the sacrifice he was willing to make for his lady love and the lady who was willing to take the fall for her man. It was embellished a bit, and Toby had a feeling that was the doing of his publicist and business manager. He also had a feeling that he would be playing a tour soon. Jeff turned, rubbing his hands briskly together. "Looks like we're back in business, bro." "Looks like," Toby confirmed with a smile. Caroline smiled, too. She was glad Toby's career was back in swing, maybe even stronger than ever, yet she was also sad. She wasn't even sure why. Maybe because deep down inside she'd already made her decision. Toby rose, pulling Caroline up with him. "We're going to get some rest," he announced. "Toby," his mother whined, "you haven't eaten anything." "Don't feel like eating, Mom. I just want to sleep." "Well, maybe you should stay in our room tonight, just so I can keep an eye on you," Ellen suggested. She hadn't meant to imply that Caroline was incapable of taking care of him. She was just wanting to baby her firstborn child, but the look on Caroline's face told her it hit home, and Joe jumped in to rescue the couple. "You kids go." He turned to his wife with a scowl. "I'm sure Caroline will be happy to stay in Toby's room and keep an eye on him." "Oh, of course. Good night, baby." She reached up and kissed her son on the cheek, then turned to deliver the same to Caroline. "Remember, wake him every 2 hours." Caroline promised that she would. Once in his room, Toby was concerned about Caroline's mood. She was quiet and reserved, and he could sense her sadness. He just wasn't sure why. She should be happy. The nightmare was over. They were free. She'd come to terms with several things in her past, including her mother. Maybe that was it. Maybe the loss of her mother still weighed heavily on her. They snuggled together. He was truly exhausted and still a little nauseated. Maybe he'd feel better in the morning. Caroline set the alarm for 2 hours and slept by his side. New scene. Detective Summers rapped his knuckles brusquely against the stained beige-colored door to the apartment just below the one rented by Caroline Jones. He glanced back over his shoulder at his partner as a young girl opened the door barely an inch and peered out. Yes? Are you Sherry? Yes? Sherry, we're from the police department. We need to come in and talk to you. My mother's at work. Actually, it's you we came to see. We need to ask you a few questions. She closed the door, and Summers raised his hand to knock again when Sherry opened it, stepped back, and motioned them in. The apartment was a far cry from the one upstairs. Dark, dank, and smelling of bacon, it boasted all the amenities. A deluxe window air conditioning unit hummed monotonously. An array of electronics included a giant TV screen, a stereo, a computer. A young boy who played video games in front of the television turned briefly to see who'd enter the room and immediately turned back to his game. The two men sat on what appeared to be a brand new sofa. Sit down, Sherry, Lieutenant Varanza said. She sank slowly down onto a matching armchair. Varanza looked her over. She was a pretty girl. Long, dark brown hair was haphazardly pulled up in a giant clip. A mild case of teenage acne did not deter from the prettiness of large blue eyes and a generous mouth. She couldn't be described as slim, more like voluptuous. Sergeant Summers spoke first. Sherry, we want to talk to you about George Mancini. She looked down. Sherry? She raised her head, her eyes filled with tears. He's dead. Yes, we know. We're trying to find out just how he died. It's her fault, Sherry said quickly. Whose fault? The lieutenant asked. Caro, she spat. Caro, the skank who lives upstairs. How is it her fault? He was in her apartment, wasn't he? She asked sarcastically. Did she send you here? Did she tell you about me? No one sent us here, Sherry, Sergeant Summers assured her. Do you remember anything out of the ordinary the night George died? She shrugged. Sherry, Varanza said, you cared for George, didn't you? She remained silent. It sounds like it bothered you that he knew Caroline Jones, he continued. Were you jealous because he liked her, maybe? He didn't like her, she insisted, her voice rising. He just wanted to do her. Okay, settle down, Sergeant Summers said, using a calming tone. He wanted her? How could he want that when he had you? Oh, that's what I said, she agreed. Tell us about your relationship, Lieutenant Varanza said, his tone soft and understanding. Her lips trembled as she began to speak. He loved me. He said he did, but all he ever talked about was Caro. She made a sour face. She's a real looker. Why can't you act more like her? You need to lose weight. Why don't you cut your hair? Maybe you should take some dance classes. Skinny witch. I don't know why he thought she was so great. I see, Lieutenant Varanza said softly. He sure didn't appreciate what he had, did he? No, she pouted. He went up to her place all the time when she wasn't home. He went through her stuff. He took me up there and we did it in her bed. I think he really got off on that. I hate her. I wish she'd been the one to die. I understand, Sherry. That must have been very hard for you, Varanza said. Sergeant Summers picked up on the line, and when you went up there that night, you meant to hurt Caroline, not George. She looked up at him, the confusion evident on her face. I didn't hurt George. I didn't go in Carol's apartment. I hated that apartment. I hated it when George went up there, and I hated it when he made me go that time. But George went up to her apartment that night, correct? Yes. He'd been drinking. He said he was leaving town, and he may not get another chance, and he said it was going to be tonight, whether she wanted it or not. Sergeant Summers' frustration surfaced for a moment. Sherry, why didn't you tell the police this when they talked to you? A tear ran down her cheek. Why should I? He was dead. It didn't matter anymore, at least not to me. Sherry, did you follow George up to Caroline's apartment that night? Lieutenant Varanza asked. Yeah. So? I was just going to watch. I wanted to see her cry, and George said he would make her suffer for me. You don't blame me, do you? She was trying to steal George from me, and I didn't do nothing wrong. I understand how you felt, Sherry, Sergeant Summers comforted, but when George got up to the apartment, Caroline wasn't there, was she? Sherry was crying again. No, she snuck out, Left early. George was mad, real mad. He picked up a baseball bat and broke her lamp and knocked a bunch of stuff off the table. Now they were getting somewhere. What happened after that, Sherry? Did you see what happened to George? She shook her head. I was in the hall outside the apartment, and I heard a car pull up outside. It was a cab, and I barely made it back to my place in time before she came in the building. I watched her come inside and go upstairs. Who? Who did you see? I don't know. Never seen her before. Veranza smiled kindly. Can you describe her to me, Sherry? Sure. She was real tall and pretty. She had black hair, all long and poofed out like a model or a movie star. She was wearing fancy clothes, probably real expensive. Do you know how long she was up there? Did you hear anything out of the ordinary? A scream or yelling? Well, she was only up there a couple minutes, and I didn't hear no scream. I did hear her say, "Get your hands off me," and then she ran down the stairs and out the door, got in the cab, and went away. Did you go back up to Miss Jones' apartment? No. I don't like George when he's like that, all drunk and talking about her. New tears welled in her eyes and spilled over. If I did, maybe George would be alive. I can't think about this right now. You know, Sherry, you should have come forward and told us this information earlier. The woman you saw probably knows how George died. I don't care. First, Carol's boyfriend was in jail for it, and I was glad about that because I knew it would make her sad. And then she went to jail, and that was even better. Lieutenant Veranza shook his head. Sending someone to jail who isn't guilty wouldn't be the right thing to do, Sherry. Certainly you know that. She frowned. I don't care. I hate her. She thinks she's better than everyone else. George said so. The detectives rose. Well, thank you for your help, Sherry. I know you're sad about George, and if you ever want to talk, you can call me. Sometimes talking about things makes it feel better, Lieutenant Veranza said. She looked up at him, surprise registering on her face. You want me to call you? That's crap. No crap, Sherry. I want you to call. Lieutenant Veranza handed her his card. That's my number right there. Any time, day or night. She took it. They left her apartment, walked out into the sunshine, and breathed deeply. What is this world coming to? Summer said gloomily. That girl gives me the creeps. Well, she's sad, and she's lonely, and has no self-esteem, and I'm hoping we can help her by talking her into getting some professional help. You're a good Samaritan, you know that? Not hardly. Just not willing to give up on one so young. Sergeant Summers changed the subject. So, I guess we need to have a word with Miss Jones and see if she knows who would have come to see her in the middle of the night. Lieutenant Veranza nodded. Perhaps one of her showbiz friends. I'll get on it. New scene. Toby turned toward Caroline, stroking her arm in an effort to wake her. Good morning, beautiful. How was your night? Mine was wonderful with you by my side, he sang. When I open my eyes and see your sweet face, it's a good morning, beautiful day. Large brown eyes blinked open. She yawned and smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. I love that song. It's a good one, all right. How are you this fine morning? Stretching her arms over her head, she grunted. Sleepy. Well, that wouldn't have anything to do with having to wake me up all night. It might. Can I make it up to you? He said softly as he leaned over to kiss her. Remembering her resolve to break things off with Toby, she stiffened and pulled away. Sure. Get me some breakfast. He sighed and sat up and leaned against the headboard. Okay, let's talk. Let's talk. There's nothing to talk about. Caroline, there's something wrong. I can see it in your eyes. Why aren't you happy? I mean, we're both out of jail. Murder charges have been dropped. You made peace with your mother before she passed. Is that it? Is it your mom's passing? She shook her head. He hadn't asked her to marry him yet, so she couldn't very well tell him that she'd decided that when he does ask her to marry him, she was seriously thinking of turning him down. She couldn't tell him if she allowed him to kiss her, she may not find the strength to turn him down. Caroline, did you just hear anything I said? She looked up into his face, so sincere and concerned about her. Lord have mercy, how she loved him. Though was it enough? Enough to let him go? Enough to allow him to find a woman who fits into his family and who could take care of him and have children and take care of his future children? Someone who'd been to church and knew Bible stories. She'd been so excited about reconciling with him. After everything that's happened, she'd promised herself she wouldn't waste any more time. Yet, would marrying Toby be selfish? Claiming Toby for herself, is that the best thing for him? Does she love him enough to do the best thing for him? She had no idea how she would go about letting him down, or even if she would. For now, she decided, she would try to act normal, try not to worry him. Sighing, she fixed him with a smile. So much has happened. I suppose I'm just a little overwhelmed. Before he could respond, she neatly changed the subject. How are you feeling? Almost completely better. Almost. He reached for her. His strong hands pulled her to him. She didn't resist. Rolling over next to her, he looked deeply into her eyes and softly kissed her nose. Caroline couldn't think of any way to avoid what was happening. She couldn't think of anything except how good it felt to have him so close, how safe she felt in his arms, how much she wanted his kiss, and he gave it to her, and when he lifted his head, she almost wept with the emptiness and quickly lifted her face for another. She was so weak to allow him to hug her, to kiss her, to lay next to her. Maybe, she thought, trying to rationalize the weakness, just this one last time. Something to remember. He had a way of kissing her that made her feel worshipped. It was wonderful to give in to him. It felt freeing to yield to his kiss, to surrender to him, to turn herself over to the care of another individual and to trust that person completely. I love you, baby, he whispered. She didn't answer. She couldn't. She didn't know what to say. It would be cruel to lead him on if she were to go through with leaving him. He stopped kissing her and turned onto his back and lay still for some time. Finally, he sighed. I can't even imagine living without you. She looked over at him, wondering if he were reading her mind. She reached over and stroked his cheek. Maybe she would be weak and selfish and just stay with him. Maybe. They were started out of the moment by Toby's phone, and Caroline listened to his deep voice. Yep. Tomorrow? Sure. You got it. For you? Anything. Who else is scheduled to appear? You're kidding. No, no problem at all. He's a friend of mine, that's all. Yep. Nope. I don't need a limo. No, I promise I won't be late. He laughed as he hung up the phone. He stroked Caroline's arm. That was Brian, my business manager. And? And he says as long as I'm in New York, I may as well do something to fix my rep. The Mike Bitters show had a cancellation, and they want me to take the open spot. Taping is tomorrow. Want to come? Really? Sure. Mike Bitters is a friend of yours? No, I've never met the man. I was speaking of another guest who will be there, Ricky Keno. You know Ricky Keno? We met at a charity function and became fast friends. She smiled. I keep forgetting you're a celebrity. To me, you're just Toby Smith, the boy who changed my life. Good. Let's keep it that way. I prefer being thought of as a real person, except I'm averse to the boy part. Why? Because what has happened between us is not the work of a boy. No, she agreed. It was definitely done by a man. He sat up on his knees and pounded his chest with his fist. That's right. A he-man. A manly man, she giggled. He raised his arm and sniffed. A smelly man. He stood. I gotta take a shower. She stood to go back to her room. You do that. I'll do the same. While Toby was in the shower, singing at the top of his lungs, Caroline headed back to her room. In preparation for a shower, she took some clothes from her suitcase and laid them on the bed, though they'd been worn twice already. She wondered when she might be able to get back into her apartment. Maybe she will give the cops a call and ask them because her plans for the day included meeting with Madame Pierre, and it would be nice if she could stop by the apartment to pick up a few things. The knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts, and she peeked out. Sergeant Summers stood there smiling. I need to ask you a few questions. She frowned. Please come in. Toby's in his room. That's okay. It's you I wanted to talk to. He smiled as if reading her thoughts. Don't worry. You're not in trouble. She offered him a seat and sat in the chair opposite him. Before he could even begin, though, Toby knocked on the door and Carol let him in. He shook the officer's hand and sat on the bed. We've talked to your neighbor, Sherry, Summers began. Caroline sat silently, waiting for him to tell her what he'd found. Did you know her very well? She shook her head. I only spoke to her a few times. She seemed to be quiet and shy. I introduced myself right after I moved in a few years ago. Did you realize that she didn't like you very much? Caroline frowned. I had no idea what she thought of me. Well, we thought she might have been the one to kill George, jealous girlfriend type of thing. She nodded. But? But I think she's telling the truth. She didn't do it, but she may have seen who did. Who? Well, that's where we need your help. She saw a woman go up to your apartment that night, shortly before George died. A tall woman, pretty, with long, thick black hair, actress or model type. Do you know someone like her? A friend from a show you were in, another dancer maybe, someone who would be coming to see you in the middle of the night? Caroline went over everyone she knew in her head who could possibly fit that description. Well, there's Alicia. She was in a chorus line with me. She has black hair, but no one would ever say she was tall since she's about 5 feet. Anyone else? As she thought, Toby circled around behind Caroline. Caroline continued, I can't think of anyone. I can think of a dozen who fit part of the description, one who is tall but has red hair, or one who is tall and has black hair but it's cut short and spiky. You say she's tall and has long dark hair? Toby asked. Summers nodded. Yeah, and well dressed. I hope it's not who I think it is. Caroline turned surprised. Who do you think it is? Tracy. Oh, Toby, you're right. Oh, my goodness, it does sound like her. Tracy? Summers asked. My ex-girlfriend, Tracy Chastain. She lives in Nashville. Why would she be visiting Miss Jones in New York in the middle of the night? Well, that I don't know. She was angry about our breakup, to put it mildly. She'd already shown vindictiveness toward Caroline. Who knows why she was there, but the description is too much like her to dismiss it. Caroline shivered. Toby took her hand as he spoke. So, what happened that night? I can't figure out why either Tracy or Mancini would be in Caroline's apartment in the middle of the night. Sergeant Summers nodded. Well, what we learned from Sherry wasn't pretty. Mancini had a real fixation on you, Miss Jones. According to Sherry, you're all he talked about. She says he went up there that night with the intention of raping you. Caroline's face paled and she clutched her stomach. Toby cursed and placed his hands protectively on Caroline's shoulders. What's a good thing someone beat me to it, because I would have murdered him myself. Sergeant Summers debated with himself whether he should tell them the rest, like the part about George and Sherry in Caroline's bed, or about Sherry's intense hatred for Miss Jones, and he decided just to leave it. No use in making Caroline feel worse than she already did. He nodded at Toby's words. Understood, but let's not go there. Well, thanks for your help. I think we'll be speaking to your ex-girlfriend very soon. Granting Caroline permission to go into her apartment, she shook their hands and took his leave. He shook their hands and took his leave. Toby turned to Caroline. I can't imagine how you're feeling. Vulnerable, I suppose. It didn't happen, though. God must have been watching over you. He glanced heavenward. Thank you, Jesus. Why would God save me? I mean, why me? There are plenty of people who don't get spared. I don't even go to church. Toby nodded. Good question. There's a lot of people who ask that question. Why would God help one person but not help someone else? I've asked that same question myself. Or maybe we can find someone to ask. Toby smiled. I think that's a great idea. I'm thanking God, though, because I recently started praying again, thanks to you, and I asked him to bring you back to me, and he has answered my prayer. Caroline sighed. That statement sort of put a kink in the thoughts she'd been thinking. Toby frowned at the expression on her face. Until we can find the answers to that question, can you find comfort in the fact that for some reason God stepped in? She looked up at him and nodded slightly. I need to take a shower. Toby watched her go, wondering what was going through her head. While Caroline showered, he touched base with his family. They would be leaving in a few hours, his parents heading back to their extended vacation, his sister to her husband in Augusta. Brother Ben would stay a few more weeks in New York before heading back to Texas, and Toby would spend some time with him while Caroline met with Madame. Still, the most important thing happening will be later, this evening, when Toby would take Caroline out for a special dinner, and this time nothing would stand in the way of him asking her to be his wife. New scene. So, Caroline, why do you come to see Madame with such a sad look on your face, eh? What can I do to help my little one to smile once more? Oh, madam, I'm so confused. I know I should be feeling happy, yet I feel close to tears. Why am I so sad? What's wrong with me? Come, Change clothes. We'll work through this. I hardly think a dance lesson will help me. You, young lady, do not know everything now, do you? Now, scoot, scoot, scoot. Caroline did as commanded, joining Madame in the west dance room. The afternoon sun shone through the windows along one wall, casting an orange light throughout the room. Soft music played. They moved to the middle of the floor and sat, their long legs spread, their arms above their heads. Slowly they began their stretch, the one Caroline had moved through almost every day for the past 12 years. First to one side, then the other, then to the middle, laying their torsos flat against the floor. Madame spoke as they moved. Now, little one, you say you're sad, yet you have no reason to be. This tells me that you're doing something against your nature. Against my nature? Yes, something that is wrong for you, something out of harmony with your vibration. Turn out your foot, young lady. Caroline obeyed and corrected her point. That's the trouble. I don't know what's wrong for me and what's right. They rose and went to the bar. Yes, you do. You're fighting against it. This is what causes your sadness. When your spirit lifts and feels excited and joyous, then you know what you're doing is right. You made your peace with your mother, no? Yes. Maybe you still feel anger inside. Maybe you still wish to be mad with her and you can't because she's gone now to the other side. As she spoke, Madame removed her foot from the bar and moved behind her student. Caroline shook her head. I don't think that's it. I don't feel anger at my mother. I understand the power the alcohol had over her, and I understand the pain she felt at my father leaving her. Madame's hand was on Caroline's waist as she spoke to her in the mirror. Posture, slowly, turn out. Good. Then maybe you are sad to be leaving all your friends. Caroline rotated to look at her. Leaving my friends? Madame forced her back toward the mirror and pulled her arms into fifth position. Yes. You will leave to marry your man, no? Caroline frowned. No. She came down from her releve. Madame tapped the back of Caroline's leg, and she rose back up on her toes. Ah, so this is where you go against yourself. That's nonsense. Toby hasn't even asked me to marry him. Caroline let go of the bar, spun once. Madame caught her by the waist, held her still, looked at her in the mirror. A matter of time. He will ask. Caroline looked down. Madame forced her chin up, straightened her shoulders. You do not love your Toby like you once thought? Caroline moved to arabesque, came back down to fifth position, spun, and back to arabesque. Well, Madame persisted. Caroline sighed. I love him so much it hurts. Madame pressed her lips together. It hurts because you fight your own feelings. Caroline came down, hands on hips. All this talk is very frustrating. Madame scowled her best scowl, clapped her hands together sharply. Discipline, young lady. You are in the middle of an exercise and you will not break concentration. Caroline sighed and moved to the middle of the floor and waited for Madame to count. And 1, and 2, and begin your turn and. Once Caroline was again proceeding through the choreographed movements, Madame started on her again. You are frustrated with yourself. Toby will ask you to marry him, and you will be denying yourself and him much happiness if you do not accept his proposal. She shrugged, but that is your way. Caroline didn't dare stop her movements, but spoke as she danced, breathing heavily. What is that supposed to mean? You are still the little girl whose mamma beats her. You are a victim. You feel you deserve punishment. Somehow she convinced you that you do not deserve to feel happiness. You are a bad girl, Caroline. You do not deserve to be happy. Nothing must ever go your way. You must always struggle financially. You must be a victim. You must not feel how good it is to have a man's arms around you and to feel safe and secure in his embrace. That's ridiculous, Caroline said, panting. But true, Madame returned. You feel you don't deserve happiness. You feel you don't deserve him. As long as you feel that way, God will oblige. He doesn't deserve me, she said softly. I don't fit in. I would be a terrible wife, a horrible homemaker, and who knows what kind of mother I would be to his children. That is what's ridiculous, Madame sang her words back to her. They finished the dance in silence, and once Caroline curtsied to Madame, she moved to the window and peered out. Madame fell in behind her, lightly touching her shoulder. Toby does not want you because you fit in. He wants you for who you are. He loves your soul. He does not marry a maid. He marries a dancer. You do not expect him to be a good homemaker and not sing, do you? No, you do not, and he does not expect that of you. You would be a wonderful wife because you love him and because he moves you in ways you never knew existed. Now, about the children. She thought a moment. I don't know what to say to make you see how good you are with children. You will be a wonderful mother because you learn from others' mistakes and because you will remember. When Caroline turned to face her, a tear escaped and she dashed it away with the back of her hand. I'm such a baby. I cry at the drop of a hat. You feel things deeply. There's no sin in that, little one. You're so good to me, madam. Oh, I'm about to be even better to you. Caroline sniffed. What do you mean? Have you thought that you will not be able to stay here and teach for me and live in Nashville with your new husband at the same time? Hands on hips, Caroline scowled. I didn't say I'd marry him yet. Madam shooed her as if she were a bothersome fly. Oh, pooh, girl, if you're a brilliant young lady, I think you are, then you will say yes to him. And then what? You've told me you will teach for me, no? Yes, I did, and that's one more reason to say no to Toby. I won't let you down. The older woman laughed. Well, if you say no, then you will most assuredly let me down. Confused and frustrated, Caroline breathed a sigh. Well, then what do you want me to do? Marry Toby or teach dance for you? Both, little one. I will explain. There are so many children, children as you once were, who have no way of learning dance. There's only so much a single dance teacher who has endeavored to open a studio can teach a child, so the children must come to New York, where the best teachers are, where we are always on the cutting edge. Unfortunately, there are many talented, dedicated children who cannot come to New York. So I was thinking, let's bring New York to them. New York's School of Dance should become a chain, and we should begin in Nashville. Stunned, Caroline listened as Madame described her plan. There is no one that I would trust more than you to run an efficient school for me in Nashville. The Nashville school will be used as a prototype. We shall measure all subsequent schools against the one in Nashville. Oh, it is so exciting, don't you think? Caroline was grinning. I think it's a wonderful idea. I also think you must be crazy to believe that I'm capable of running a school. Madame shrugged. You are quite capable of running the artistic aspects of the school. If you need an administrator to help you with business, then so be it. I don't know what to say. You bestow upon me a great honor. Say yes, little one, to me and to your handsome man. And that is the end of chapter 11.